You can be surrounded by people and still feel profoundly alone, not because you lack company, but because something essential is missing. There are moments when voices fill the room, when laughter moves easily between people, when conversations flow without effort, and yet something inside you remains untouched. And if this feels familiar, then this video is for you. This feeling is more common than you think. And it doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It means you experience connection differently. According to Carl Jung, loneliness is not always about isolation. Sometimes it appears when the inner world is deeper than the outer one. And today, we explore why this feeling exists and what it is quietly asking of you. This kind of loneliness is often misunderstood. It does not come from isolation. It does not come from being unwanted. It comes from a deeper misalignment between inner and outer worlds. Carl Jung understood this loneliness well. He saw it not as a social failure, but as a psychological condition, a signal from the psyche that something essential is not being met. Loneliness, in this sense, is not the absence of people. It is the absence of resonance. You may be physically present, but inwardly you are not met. You may be seen, but not recognized. You may be included, but not understood. This is why the feeling can be so confusing. From the outside, everything looks fine. There's no obvious reason for the ache, and yet it persists. Jung believed that the psyche longs for relationship, not only with others, but with meaning, authenticity, and truth. When social interaction remains at the surface, the deeper layers of the self remain unengaged. And when the deeper self is ignored, loneliness arises, even in crowds. Some people feel this more intensely than others. Those who are introspective, intuitive, emotionally aware, or oriented toward depth often experience this form of loneliness early in life. They sense more. They feel more. They look for meaning beneath words. And when conversation stays superficial, when emotions are avoided, when vulnerability is replaced with performance, they feel alone even while surrounded. Jung described this as a mismatch between the inner world and the collective environment. The collective world values speed, certainty, roles, and appearances. The inner world values slowness, ambiguity, reflection, and feeling. When you live closer to the inner world, ordinary social life can feel strangely empty, not because people are unkind, but because the level of engagement is not aligned with who you are. You may notice this especially in group settings. You are present, but you do not feel involved. You are included, but not connected. You may even be liked, yet still feel unseen. This happens because connection requires more than proximity. It requires presence, and presence requires authenticity. Many people interact through roles rather than selves. They speak from habit rather than truth. They respond automatically rather than consciously. For someone attuned to depth, this can feel profoundly isolating. You are listening for something real and hearing only noise. Jung believed that loneliness intensifies when the ego, the conscious sense of self, is disconnected from the deeper psyche. In social settings, we often present persona, a mask designed to fit expectations, a version of ourselves shaped by what is acceptable. The persona is not false, but it is incomplete. When you spend too much time behind this mask, you begin to feel unreal. You may be talking, but not expressing, smiling, but not feeling, engaging, but not revealing. Over time, this creates an inner split. One part of you is present socially. Another part remains hidden, unheard, untouched. Loneliness emerges in that split because the part of you that longs for connection is not the part being offered. This is why you can feel lonelier in company than when you are alone. When you are alone, there is no pretense, no mask, no performance. You are at least whole, but among others, you may feel divided. Jung would say that the psyche suffers when it is forced to fragment itself for acceptance. And yet, many people do this unconsciously. They learn early that depth is inconvenient, that sensitivity is excessive, that honesty is risky. So they adapt. They learn to stay light. They learn to stay agreeable. They learn to stay silent about what truly moves within them. Over time, this adaptation becomes habitual, and loneliness becomes familiar. Another reason this loneliness appears is because of unintegrated inner material. Jung spoke of the shadow, the parts of the self that are hidden, denied, or unexpressed. When the shadow remains unconscious, it interferes with connection. You may feel misunderstood, but not know why. You may feel distant, but not know what is missing. Often, what is missing is your own truth. Parts of you remain unspoken. Feelings remain unshared. Experiences remain unacknowledged, not because others forbid it, but because you have learned to withhold. And what is withheld becomes isolating. Loneliness is often the psyche's way of saying, something in you wants to be seen, not praised, not fixed, simply recognized. But recognition requires courage. It requires the willingness to risk being misunderstood. In order to be known, many people avoid this risk. They remain socially connected, but inwardly alone. Jung believed that real connection only occurs between individuals who are differentiated, who know who they are, and are willing to stand in that truth. Without differentiation, connection becomes shallow. Without authenticity, intimacy cannot form. This is why you may feel closer to someone in a single honest conversation than after years of polite interaction. Depth recognizes depth. Truth responds to truth. Another layer of this loneliness comes from the collective unconscious. Jung observed that human beings share a deep psychological layer, filled with inherited emotions, archetypes, and unresolved experiences. Some individuals are more sensitive to this layer. They pick up on collective anxiety, unspoken grief, underlying tension in social environments. They may feel overwhelmed without knowing why. The loneliness that follows is not personal. It is existential. You are sensing something beneath the surface and finding no language for it. Others may not feel it or may not want to, and so you feel alone with your perception. This can create the sense that you are out of place, that you don't quite belong, that something is wrong with you. But Jung would say, nothing is wrong. You are simply oriented toward a different layer of experience. Loneliness, in this sense, is not a defect. It is a signal, a sign that your psyche is asking for alignment. Not more people, but more truth. Not more interaction, but more meaning. This loneliness often intensifies during periods of growth, when the psyche is changing, old ways of relating no longer fit. Conversations that once felt adequate now feel empty. Connections that once sustained you now feel distant. This does not mean you are regressing. It means you are differentiating. Jung called this process individuation, the movement toward becoming oneself. Individuation is often lonely, not because it separates you from others, but because it separates you from who you were expected to be. As you grow, you may feel increasingly alone in familiar spaces, not because you have changed into someone cold, but because you are becoming more real. This transition is uncomfortable. You may question yourself. You may wonder if you're asking for too much, if your longing for depth is unrealistic. But Jung believed that the psyche does not ask for what is impossible. It asks for what is necessary. Loneliness then becomes an invitation to ask different questions. Not, why don't I fit in? But, where am I not being myself? Not, why do I feel alone? But, what part of me is unheard? As you begin to listen, the loneliness shifts. It does not disappear overnight, but it changes quality. It becomes less painful and more informative. You begin to recognize that not all spaces are meant to hold you. Not all connections are meant to be deep. Not all interactions are meant to satisfy the soul. And that is not a failure. It is discernment. Jung believed that maturity involves accepting that not everyone can meet you at depth, and that forcing connection where depth is absent only deepens loneliness. Real connection requires choice. It requires waiting. It requires patience. It requires the courage to remain alone until something genuine appears. This does not mean withdrawing from the world. It means relating consciously. You stop offering your inner world where it cannot be received. You stop expecting resonance where there is none. And slowly, you begin to find spaces and people where presence is mutual, where silence is comfortable, where words carry weight, where you do not have to translate yourself. These connections may be rare, but they are real, and they nourish in a way constant interaction never could. Jung would say that the goal is not to eliminate loneliness, but to understand it. When loneliness is understood, it no longer isolates. It guides. It teaches you where to belong, not socially, but psychologically. You begin to see that feeling alone among others is not a verdict on your worth. It is a message from the psyche, asking you to live more truthfully. And when you do, connection changes. You may still be alone at times, but you are no longer lost. You are with yourself. And from that place, real connection becomes possible. Being with yourself is not the same as being isolated. It is not withdrawal. It is not defeat. It is orientation. When you learn to remain inwardly present with yourself, the desperation to be understood by everyone begins to soften. You stop scanning rooms for validation. You stop measuring your worth by how connected you appear. This does not make you distant. It makes you grounded. Jung believed that many people seek connection not from wholeness, but from fragmentation. They look to others to supply what has not been cultivated within. But when you feel alone even around others, it often means you are no longer willing to live from fragmentation. Something in you has matured. You may not yet have language for it, but your psyche knows that superficial closeness is no longer enough. This is why the loneliness can feel sharper during moments of growth. You are shedding old forms of belonging before new ones have appeared. This in-between space is uncomfortable. It feels empty, uncertain, quiet in a way that feels exposed. But Jung would say this space is necessary. It is a psychological equivalent of dusk, the moment between day and night, when familiar shapes lose their clarity, and something new is forming, though not yet visible. Many people rush to escape this space. They fill it with noise, with constant interaction, with distractions that numb the feeling. But the loneliness remains, because it is not asking to be silenced. It is asking to be listened to. Loneliness often carries information about what you need to change, not externally, but internally. It may be asking you to stop betraying your own rhythm, to match others, to stop shrinking your thoughts, to keep conversations light, to stop abandoning your inner life for the sake of social comfort. Jung believed that when we repeatedly ignore such signals, the psyche intensifies them. What begins as subtle discomfort becomes persistent loneliness, not to punish, but to redirect. This is why the feeling often does not disappear. Even when your social life improves, you may have friends, conversations, engagement, and still feel alone. Because the issue was never quantity. It was alignment. Alignment between who you are and how you are living, between what you feel and what you allow yourself to express, between what you sense and what you permit yourself to honor. As this alignment begins to form, something important changes. You become more selective, not in a judgmental way, but in a truthful one. You begin to notice which environments drain you and which quietly restore you, which conversations leave you feeling hollow, and which leave you feeling settled, which connections require constant effort, and which feel natural even in silence. This discernment is not selfish. It is psychological maturity. Jung believed that the psyche seeks balance, not endless stimulation. And for many people, that balance includes periods of solitude. Solitude is often misunderstood. It is seen as absence, but Jung saw it as a space of integration, a place where the psyche can process, digest, and realign. For those who feel alone around others, solitude can initially feel confronting. Without distraction, the loneliness becomes more noticeable. But if you stay with it, without trying to escape, something shifts. The loneliness begins to reveal its shape. You may notice sadness beneath it, or anger, or a longing that has gone unnamed for years. This is not regression. It is contact. Contact with parts of yourself that were postponed for the sake of adaptation. As these parts come into awareness, the loneliness changes again. It becomes less about absence and more about truth. You realize that feeling alone among others was not because you were disconnected from humanity. It was because you were disconnected from yourself in order to remain socially acceptable, and that disconnection has a cost. Jung warned that when the self is sacrificed too often, the psyche responds with symptoms. Loneliness is one of those symptoms, not as a punishment, but as a message that says something essential has been left behind. Reclaiming that essential part does not mean rejecting others. It means including yourself. You begin to speak more honestly, even if your voice trembles. You begin to allow pauses. Even if silence feels uncomfortable, you begin to say no, even when approval is withheld. These small acts of authenticity slowly change your experience of connection, not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily. You may notice that some relationships fall away. This can feel painful, but Jung would say this is not loss. It is differentiation. Relationships built on adaptation often cannot survive authenticity, and that is not a failure. It is clarity. At the same time, new forms of connection may begin to emerge, often unexpectedly, through quieter moments, through shared silence, through conversations that do not rush. These connections may be fewer, but they are deeper. They do not eliminate loneliness entirely, but they transform it. Loneliness becomes something you pass through, not something you live inside. You learn that being alone at times is not the same as being abandoned. You learn that not every room is meant to hold you. You learn that belonging is not about fitting everywhere, but about fitting somewhere, including within yourself. Jung believed that the deepest form of belonging is not social, it is internal. It comes from being in relationship with one's own psyche. When that relationship strengthens, external loneliness loses its power. You may still feel moments of distance among others. That is part of being human, but it no longer destabilizes you. You understand it. You know when to stay and when to step back. You know when to speak and when to remain silent. You know when connection is possible and when solitude is wiser. This knowing is quiet. It does not announce itself. It feels like steadiness, like an inner anchor. Jung would say that this is the beginning of psychological wholeness, not because loneliness disappears, but because it no longer defines you. You are no longer trying to escape it. You are no longer ashamed of it. You see it for what it is, a messenger, and when its message is heard, it softens. You may still walk among others and feel different, but different no longer means alone. It means you are living from a deeper place, a place where presence matters more than performance, a place where connection is chosen, not forced, a place where you no longer abandon yourself to avoid being alone. And from that place, true connection becomes possible, not everywhere, not always, but when it happens, it is real, and real connection, even in small amounts, is enough. And so, if you feel alone even when others are near, let this understanding settle slowly. Not everything that feels like loneliness is asking to be filled. Some forms of loneliness are asking to be honored. They appear when the soul outgrows old ways of belonging, when the psyche refuses to remain shallow, when something truer is trying to emerge. You are not broken for feeling this way. You are not deficient, and you are not failing at connection. You are listening to a deeper layer of yourself. Carl Jung believed that the task of life is not to eliminate inner tension, but to hold it consciously. Loneliness, when understood, does not isolate, it differentiates. It teaches you where you end and where others begin. It teaches you to stop abandoning yourself for the comfort of fitting in. And when you stop abandoning yourself, something subtle but powerful happens. You may still feel alone at times, but you no longer feel lost. You begin to carry a quiet sense of inner companionship, a steadiness that does not depend on the room you are in, a presence that remains with you, even when others cannot meet you at depth. From this place, connection becomes simpler, cleaner, more honest. You no longer seek to be understood by everyone, only to be true, and that is enough, because truth does not need an audience. It does not ask to be agreed with. It simply asks to be lived. When you stop bending yourself to fit what surrounds you, the inner noise begins to soften. You move more slowly. You listen more carefully. You feel less pressure to perform. In this quiet alignment, something changes. You are no longer searching for belonging everywhere. You are no longer measuring yourself against every room. You begin to recognize that peace comes, not from being seen by many, but from no longer hiding from yourself. Loneliness, once feared, loses its sharpness. It becomes spacious. It becomes honest. It becomes a place where you can rest, rather than something you must escape. From here, connection happens differently. It arrives without effort, without explanation, without disguise, and even when it does not arrive, you remain whole. Thank you for listening. Until next time, take care of what is truly yours.